In 2018, Ubisoft's stock peaked at over €100 per share. The company was worth $12 billion. They had built an empire on a simple formula. Find a creative vision, scale it, repeat it, extract every last dollar. By 2025, that stock had collapsed to under €10. 85% of the company's value had evaporated. Investors were calling for the CEO's head. Analysts were describing the situation as a total meltdown. The debt exceeded the market cap. The company was worth less than what it owed. And everyone kept asking the same question. How did this happen? The answer is simpler than it seems. And darker. What happened? Assassin's Creed happened. Not the game itself. The game was brilliant. What killed Ubisoft was what they did after the game succeeded. The machine they built around it. The process that turned a masterpiece into a product line. This is not a story about a franchise going bad. It's a story about what happens when a corporation perfects the art of creative extraction. When the goal shifts from making something special to making something profitable. When success becomes a curse because it teaches all the wrong lessons. Ubisoft didn't fail despite their formula. They failed because of it. The same optimization that generated billions in revenue eventually hollowed out everything that made players care. This is how you turn a masterpiece into a machine, and how that machine eventually breaks down. Think about what Ubisoft had. One of the most beloved franchises in gaming history. Recognizable characters. Settings that spanned all of human civilization. A concept so flexible that it could support virtually unlimited sequels. And they still managed to destroy it. Not by neglect, by optimization. The story of Assassin's Creed is a business case study hiding inside a video game franchise. It teaches us about the seductive danger of formulas, about what happens when process replaces vision, about the long, slow death of creative distinctiveness in the pursuit of quarterly earnings. Let's start at the beginning, not with the first game, with the vision that made the first game possible. Patrice Désilets was a filmmaker who accidentally became a game designer. He joined Ubisoft in the late 90s and directed Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time, one of the most acclaimed games of its generation. After that success, Ubisoft wanted him to make another Prince of Persia sequel. He had a different idea. Désilets had been reading about secret societies and historical assassins. He imagined a game where players could move freely through richly detailed historical cities, climbing buildings, blending into crowds, striking from the shadows. Not a linear action game. An open world where the assassination itself was just the climax of careful preparation. The concept was radical for 2004. Open worlds existed, but nothing like this. The technology wasn't ready. The processing power to render dense crowds and climbable architecture didn't exist yet on current consoles. But next-generation hardware was coming, and Désilets convinced Ubisoft to let him build something unprecedented for it. The original Assassin's Creed took 4 years to develop. Think about that. 4 years of focused creative work, driven by a singular vision, building technology that didn't exist to realize concepts that hadn't been attempted before. The game released in 2007 and sold 8 million copies. It was immediately recognized as something special. Critics complained about repetitive mission structure, but they praised the ambition, the world building, the feeling of inhabiting a living historical city. Players had never experienced anything quite like climbing the towers of Jerusalem, standing at the peak and surveying a city full of potential targets, disappearing into a crowd after a public assassination. The fantasy was intoxicating. What made it work wasn't just the technology, it was the coherence. Every element of the game served a central fantasy. The climbing wasn't just traversal, it was reconnaissance. The crowds weren't just decoration, they were hiding spots. The assassinations weren't just action sequences, they were the culmination of careful observation and planning. Désilets came from film. He understood that great experiences have a point of view, a director's vision. Every choice in Assassin's Creed reflected his specific understanding of what made assassination feel powerful and consequential. This coherence would prove difficult to replicate, and then Ubisoft made a decision that would define everything that followed. Assassin's Creed 2 released just 2 years after the original. not 4 years. 2. Desilets and his team polished everything that didn't work in the first game. Better mission variety, more compelling characters, a new setting in Renaissance Italy with even more beautiful architecture to climb. Assassin's Creed 2 is still considered one of the greatest games ever made. Ezio Auditore became an iconic character. The game sold even better than the original. Success. Massive, undeniable, repeatable success. This is where the story turns. Because Ubisoft looked at this success and drew a specific conclusion. The conclusion was not that creative vision and adequate development time produce great games. The conclusion was that annual releases could work. Here's the logic that seemed reasonable at the time. Assassin's Creed was a hit. Assassin's Creed 2 was a bigger hit. The appetite for these games was enormous. Why not satisfy that appetite as frequently as possible? The gaming industry has precedents for annual releases. Sports games release every year. Call of Duty releases every year. These franchises generate billions. Why couldn't Assassin's Creed do the same? The difference, which would only become apparent later, was that Assassin's Creed wasn't selling a predictable formula. It was selling historical tourism, the chance to visit eras you'd never see otherwise. Renaissance Italy, Revolutionary America, Victorian London. The appeal was the freshness of each new setting, the feeling of discovery. Annual releases would eventually make discovery feel routine. From 2009 onward, there would be a new Assassin's Creed every single year. To understand what this meant, you have to understand how Ubisoft structured the operation. They didn't have one team making annual games. That would be impossible. They had multiple teams, staggered across multiple games, each in different stages of development simultaneously. By 2014, Assassin's Creed Unity required 10 different Ubisoft studios around the world working together. 10 studios, in 6 countries, thousands of people coordinating across time zones to ship a single product. This was presented as an achievement, a marvel of modern game development. The ability to create enormous open worlds on aggressive timelines through distributed production. But something was being lost in this efficiency. Desilets left Ubisoft in 2010, during the development of Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. He cited a desire for more creative independence. The official story was amicable. The reality was more complicated. The man who created Assassin's Creed walked away from Assassin's Creed, and Ubisoft barely noticed. The machine didn't need him anymore. Think about what that means. The person whose vision defined the franchise had become expendable to the franchise. The system had extracted everything useful from his ideas and encoded it into processes, tools, and templates that anyone could execute. This is the fundamental nature of creative industrialization. You start with an artist who has a vision. You build a system to execute that vision at scale. Eventually, the system becomes self-perpetuating. The artist becomes replaceable. The vision becomes a template. It's efficient. It's predictable. It's also soul-destroying. Desilets had a specific philosophy about what Assassin's Creed meant. The original plan was for a trilogy that would culminate in a modern-day story. There was purpose behind the structure, an ending in mind. Once he left, that purpose dissolved. The franchise became open-ended. There was no plan, because planning would limit exploitation. Why end something profitable? Why conclude a story when you can extend it indefinitely? The games kept coming. The settings changed. The characters rotated. But the structure ossified. Ubisoft had perfected the template. Open world. Towers to climb that reveal the map. Icons scattered across that map representing activities. Collectibles. Side quests. A progression system that unlocks new abilities. A story that provides context without getting in the way of the grinding. This template didn't just apply to Assassin's Creed. It applied to Far Cry, to Watch Dogs, to Ghost Recon, to nearly every major Ubisoft franchise. Different settings, different characters, but the same fundamental structure underneath. Players started calling it the Ubisoft formula, and they didn't mean it as a compliment. The problem wasn't that the formula was bad. It was competent, reliable. Each game delivered dozens of hours of content. You always knew what you were getting. That predictability became the problem. When players can predict exactly what a game will offer before playing it, something crucial has been lost. The surprise, the discovery, the feeling that the developers might show you something you've never seen before. The Ubisoft formula eliminated that possibility. Every tower you climbed revealed the same types of icons. Every icon led to the same types of activities. Every region felt like a reskinned version of regions you'd already explored. The games kept getting bigger. They didn't get more interesting. The criticism intensified after Unity launched in 2014, not because the formula had changed, but because the formula had finally been exposed in the most embarrassing way possible. The game was broken. Characters appeared with missing faces, just floating eyeballs and teeth against empty skin. Frame rates collapsed. Players fell through the world. Connections to servers failed constantly. The game that required 10 studios to build couldn't function on launch day. Ubisoft apologized. They stopped selling the Season Pass. They gave away downloadable content for free. They offered refunds on certain conditions. They promised to do better. But the damage was deeper than a bad launch. Unity revealed what happens when you optimize for scale over craft. When the schedule becomes more important than the quality. When the machine keeps running regardless of whether the product is ready. 10 studios working on one game sounds impressive until you realize what it means in practice. Nobody owns the vision. Nobody can say no. Nobody has the authority to stop the train when it's heading toward disaster. Each studio does their part. They meet their milestones. They check their boxes. And somehow the aggregate result is a broken mess, because nobody was responsible for the coherence of the whole. This is the paradox of distributed production. More people should mean more capability. Instead, it often means more diffusion. The accountability spreads so thin that it disappears entirely. Unity should have been Ubisoft's warning sign. It should have prompted genuine reflection about whether the annual model was sustainable, about whether scale was worth the cost. Instead, they treated it as an execution failure, a one-time mistake. They apologized, patched, and kept the machine running. Sales for the next game, Syndicate, suffered directly because of Unity's failure. Ubisoft finally acknowledged what everyone already knew. The annual release strategy was causing franchise fatigue. They skipped a year. Origins came out in 2017 after a 2-year gap. The game was praised as a return to form, a reinvention of the formula, bigger maps, role-playing mechanics, a fresh setting in ancient Egypt. But here's the thing about the supposed reinvention. It wasn't a reinvention of the template. It was an expansion of it. The maps got bigger. The icon checklists got longer. The grinding got more pronounced. The games got so large that players couldn't possibly complete everything without dedicating hundreds of hours or paying for experience boosters. Ubisoft had learned the wrong lesson again. They thought the problem was stale presentation. The real problem was the underlying philosophy. The belief that more is always better. That scale justifies everything. Assassin's Creed Valhalla, released in 2020, required 17 studios working together. 17. The game was so large that players complained about being unable to finish it. 100 hours of content, much of it feeling identical. The same outposts, the same treasure hunts, the same combat encounters, repeated across an endless map. The game sold extremely well. Ubisoft trumpeted it as one of their most successful launches ever. But the sales masked something troubling. Players were buying the games without finishing them. They were burning out faster. The formula that once created devoted fans was now creating exhausted consumers. And then the real collapse began. Star Wars Outlaws, Ubisoft's attempt to leverage one of entertainment's most valuable franchises, underperformed dramatically in 2024. The game was reviewed as competent but uninspired. Another open world, another checklist, another product manufactured by committee. Assassin's Creed Shadows was delayed, then delayed again. Each delay represented an admission that the game wasn't ready. Each admission further eroded investor confidence. The stock kept falling. The delays were particularly damaging because they exposed something Ubisoft had denied for years. That quality and schedule were in tension. That you couldn't have annual releases and polished products. That something had to give. For years, Ubisoft insisted they had solved this problem through scale. More studios meant more capacity. More capacity meant they could maintain quality while hitting dates. The delays proved this was always a comfortable lie. The games were never as polished as they should have been. They shipped with bugs, with repetition, with content that felt like filler. The schedule dictated everything. Now, with the formula finally failing commercially, they were forced to choose quality over schedule. And the schedule delays revealed just how far behind they actually were. By early 2025, Ubisoft's market capitalization had dropped below its total debt. The company was worth less than what it owed. Tencent, the Chinese gaming giant that already owned 10%, was circling. Shareholders were demanding management changes. Analysts were speculating about bankruptcy. This is where the Ubisoft story intersects with larger questions about creative industries. What happens when you treat art like manufacturing? When you optimize every variable for efficiency and predictability? When the creative process becomes a production pipeline? For a while, it works. The system generates reliable returns. Shareholders are happy. The company grows. But creativity doesn't scale the way manufacturing does. You can't assembly line innovation. You can't committee your way to inspiration. The more you systematize the creative process, the more you squeeze out exactly the qualities that made the original work special. Assassin's Creed was special because Patrice Désilets spent 4 years pursuing a vision that nobody else could have imagined. The game that resulted was imperfect but distinctive. It felt like something one person believed in deeply. The games that followed were progressively more polished and progressively less distinctive. More features, bigger worlds, better graphics, but somehow less soul. This isn't unique to Ubisoft. The same pattern plays out across entertainment. Movies become franchise installments. Music becomes algorithm-optimized playlists. Books become content. Every creative industry eventually discovers the efficiency of the formula and the prison of the formula. The companies that escape this trap are the ones that understand something counterintuitive. That constraint often produces better work than abundance. That creative vision can't be distributed across 17 studios. That sometimes the answer isn't more, but better. Nintendo rarely releases more than one major Mario game every few years. Rockstar took 8 years between Grand Theft Auto V and its next major release. From Software builds games with singular creative directors who maintain consistent visions across entire projects. These companies frustrate analysts who want predictable annual content. But they produce games that players remember, games that define eras, games that create devoted fans rather than exhausted consumers. Ubisoft chose a different path. They chose scale. They chose frequency. They chose optimization. And for a while, it made them very rich. Now, they're watching it all collapse. The irony is painful. Ubisoft pioneered something genuinely impressive. They built a global production network capable of creating some of the largest games ever made. They employed thousands of talented developers across 6 continents. They shipped consistently, year after year, when many studios struggled to ship at all. And none of it mattered because they forgot why any of it mattered. The production capability was supposed to serve the creative vision. Instead, the creative vision was compressed to fit the production capability. The machine became the master. The art became the servant. This happens more often than people realize. Companies build impressive operations. Those operations develop their own logic. Eventually, the operation justifies itself. The original purpose becomes secondary to keeping the operation running. Ubisoft kept making games because they had built a system for making games. The question of whether those games should exist, whether they served any purpose beyond feeding the machine, was never asked. There are 3 lessons here that extend far beyond video games. Lesson 1. Success can teach the wrong lessons. Assassin's Creed 2 succeeded because talented people had enough time to make something great. Ubisoft concluded that the success could be replicated through process. They optimized for output instead of quality. The optimization worked until it didn't. Every business faces this temptation. Early success comes from doing something special. The instinct is to systematize what made you special. But the special thing often resists systematization. It depends on specific people, specific circumstances, specific amounts of time and attention. When you try to scale the unscalable, you end up with a simulacrum. Something that looks like the original but doesn't feel like it. Players couldn't articulate why later Assassin's Creed games felt hollow. They just felt it. Lesson 2. Scale has hidden costs. 10 studios. 17 studios. Thousands of people coordinating across continents. This sounds impressive until you realize what it means for creative coherence. Every additional studio adds communication overhead. Every additional person adds coordination cost. Every additional time zone adds delay and misunderstanding. The thing that should make production easier actually makes it harder to maintain a unified vision. The most creative work tends to come from small, focused teams with clear leadership. Not because small teams are inherently better, but because they can maintain the coherence that creativity requires. Large teams can execute at scale, but execution and innovation are different things. Ubisoft proved you can build enormous games with distributed global teams. They also proved that those games tend to feel like they were built by distributed global teams. Something essential gets lost in the coordination. Lesson 3. Formulas have diminishing returns. The first time players climbed a tower and revealed a map full of icons, it felt exciting. The 100th time, it felt like a chore. Formulas work because they're familiar. Players know what to expect. They can jump in without a learning curve. But that same familiarity creates fatigue. The predictability that initially feels comfortable eventually feels boring. Ubisoft kept refining the formula without questioning whether the formula itself was the problem. They made prettier icons, bigger maps, more diverse activities. But the underlying structure remained identical across years and franchises. This is what happens when companies fall in love with their processes. The process becomes sacred. It can be improved, but never questioned. Any problems must be execution failures, not design failures. The executives who built the formula couldn't see it as a problem because it had been their greatest achievement. The system that scaled Assassin's Creed from one team to 17 studios was their creation. Their identity was wrapped up in its success. Admitting the formula was flawed would mean admitting their life's work was flawed. People rarely do that willingly. Eventually, players started describing Ubisoft games as interchangeable. That's the death of creative distinctiveness. When your products become commodities, you compete on price and convenience instead of quality. And there's always someone willing to be cheaper or more convenient. The Ubisoft story isn't over. The company still exists. They still have talented developers. They still own valuable franchises. A turnaround is theoretically possible, but turnarounds require admitting what went wrong. And the people who built the machine are rarely the ones who can dismantle it. They're too invested in the logic that created it. They see the formula as an asset when it's become a liability. Assassin's Creed started as one person's vision of what games could be. A filmmaker turned game designer, imagining something nobody had seen before, convincing a corporation to give him 4 years to build it. 17 years later, that vision has become a global production operation requiring 17 studios and thousands of people to produce content that feels increasingly indistinguishable from everything else on the market. That transformation wasn't inevitable. It was chosen. Every optimization, every efficiency, every scale decision was made by executives who believed they were improving on the original. They weren't. They were diluting it. There's a version of this story where Ubisoft made different choices, where they treated each Assassin's Creed as a special event rather than an annual obligation, where they gave creative directors the authority to refuse deadlines, where quality mattered more than quantity. In that version, we might have gotten 5 legendary Assassin's Creed games instead of 15 forgettable ones. The franchise would be smaller, but more beloved. The company would be less impressive on spreadsheets, but more sustainable in reality. That version never happened because it required saying no to easy money. It required patience. It required believing that less could be more. Corporations rarely make those choices. Shareholders want growth. Executives want promotions. Everyone has incentives to extract value now, rather than preserve it for later. Ubisoft extracted, and now there's nothing left. The masterpiece became a machine, and now the machine is breaking down.